Welcome back to the Strategist Is In. I'm Dr. Loren M. Someone asked me recently whether I thought I'd changed since I started my career. And my honest answer was, I'm not entirely sure which changes were actually mine. Because some of what we call growth is growth. And some of what we call growth is adaptation that became so familiar, we stopped questioning it. That distinction is worth sitting with. Let's get into it. I remember noticing that meetings became easier when I stopped bringing certain ideas to the room. Not better, just easier. And that realization was confusing at first, because I had originally been recruited into that role specifically because people described me as innovative, forward-thinking, creative. That was the language that was used. So when I arrived, I brought ideas, research-backed ones, different approaches, new interventions, just really being what I considered a sort of a thought leader, and in a good way, a little bit of, provocation around changes that needed to be made. Not in a bad way. I wasn't doing anything disruptive. Again, I really thought that I was doing the things that they had brought me in to do. And every time, the response was a version that looked like, we'll take that under consideration. Polite, professional, completely immovable. And eventually something started to change, not dramatically, not all at once. I started noticing which kinds of contributions created energy and which ones created resistance. Over time, I adapted. I became more careful, more measured, more realistic. That's what I told myself. And at the time, some of that was probably maturity, some of it was political awareness, and some of it was strategy. And at some point, it probably looked externally like growth, but some of it was also contraction. Because the problem wasn't that I stopped having ideas. The problem is that eventually I just stopped offering them. Not because they disappeared, but because the environment slowly trained me to understand which parts created momentum and which parts created resistance. Essentially, which parts of me were easiest to absorb. So let me pause there for a moment. What parts of yourself have become less visible? Not because they no longer exist, but because visibility stopped feeling useful. What do you automatically edit now before you even walk into the room? And I really want to be careful here, because this is where conversations like this often become oversimplified. Some adaptation is absolutely necessary. Some restraint is intelligent. Some environments, I dare say all environments, require political awareness. You got to be able to read the room and know, when to step up, when to step back, when to observe, etc. So this is not a conversation about always speaking up. That is frankly naive, especially where environments, those in which people remember who creates friction. And you want to be mindful about, the capital you use when you use your voice in certain environments. Essentially, the real question is subtler than that. At what point does adaptation stop being strategic and start becoming automatic? But my own experience was only part of the picture. I also watched what was happening to people around me, which people continue to bring forward bold ideas, challenging assumptions, pushing aggressively for change. And I also watched what happened to some of them. The resistance, the isolation, the consequences that followed without anyone naming those things directly. And after a while, the lessons become very clear. Some kinds of visibility were safer than others. So I also want to contextualize this a bit by saying I noticed who was rewarded for their resistance or their disruption or their bringing new ideas forward. Those folks, it kind of didn't look like me, right? So I'll just let that land where it does. And so when does it become punitive and when is it rewarded? We'll continue to look at that, and we have examined that in the past, but I think it's definitely worth naming that. So my adaptation wasn't irrational, it was observational. And I think that's important to name. A lot of people and places and environments don't ask you to disappear all at once. It happens in smaller ways over time. And again, you learn what gets rewarded, what gets ignored, what creates friction, and what keeps things moving. Eventually, the editing becomes automatic. You stop experiencing it as editing, and eventually you stop bringing certain parts of yourself into the room without even realizing you're doing it. And externally, it can very much look like professionalism. It can look like composure, strategic thinking, being easy to work with. But internally, it can start to feel exhausting in a very specific way. Because constantly assessing what needs to be done to stay safe, to, have some way of challenging things safely, it's just a lot of energy and effort. So you just might just tap out. You also stop thinking, what your thought process, I'll say it this way, is like, how not can I improve this, but how can I survive here, right? And that's a bit unfortunate for a number of reasons. Institutions really thrive on innovation and sometimes challenging status quo and systems, but that can take a very big toll. And again, it's not always the best strategy. So consider this. Which parts of how you currently operate feel intentional? And then which parts feel automatic? What behaviors in your environment get rewarded repeatedly? And what has that reward trained you to become? Who benefits from the version of you that learned to stay easy to absorb? And if you continue operating this way long term, What do you think becomes more visible, and what slowly disappears? What kind of adaptation can be challenging? I would say that this kind of adaptation can be very difficult to recognize when you're inside of it, because it often looks like success. It looks like professionalism. It looks like being strategic. And again, sometimes it is. But sometimes it's also survival becoming identity. And once that happens, people often stop questioning. They just call it professionalism. And if something in this conversation feels familiar, not dramatic, just familiar, that may be worth paying closer attention to than you have before. Because the longer a survival strategy works, the easier it becomes to sort of mistake it as personality or even your identity. And that's usually where this deserves deeper examination. And that's part of what we're staying with this season. Not just performance, not just burnout, not just leadership, but the subtler ways environment shape behavior, identity, visibility, and possibility. Some environments don't ask you to disappear all at once. They ask you in smaller ways over time, until eventually you stop noticing what you no longer bring into the room. That shapes more than most people think. We'll keep building from here. One more thing before you go on. If this conversation sparks something in you, I've created a companion reflection worksheet to go alongside this episode. You can find it in the show notes. It's free. I'm Dr. Loren M. This is The Strategist Is In. Until next time, build well.